want to share something that is out of Isaiah. Actually, I just want to share a little bit about Isaiah. I know as themes go, I love our theme. I love this passage, and I thought, one of these days I just want to unpack this a little bit together within the context of Isaiah. So this might be a little bit, hopefully not just like class, but a little bit like that. I said this morning in our wisdom literature class, we're studying Ecclesiastes. And if Ecclesiastes is sort of like sitting around with a cup of coffee with some good friends late at night on cushy couches, Isaiah is falling on your face in front of the Lord. Isaiah is a book that calls you to worship. Ecclesiastes is a book that calls you to consider and to ruminate and reflect and think. We need both of these. But I love Isaiah. Some of the grandest pictures, including the one from our theme, of the future, of God's ideals, are laid out for us in the book of Isaiah. It's a confusing book. It's a complex book. It's a tapestry of sorts, of bringing together prophetic oracles from different time periods, not necessarily in chronological order. Some of the prophetic books are like that. Ezekiel is kind of like that. But Isaiah might start by talking about some 8th century event and then move on to some 5th century event and then back to the 8th century. And it seems to be sort of a collection of prophetic words from different time periods. The text of Isaiah 11, 1 through 9, I want to read for us and then kind of work through it a little bit. So, hear the word of the Lord, Isaiah 11, 1 through 9. A shoot shall come out from the stump of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of his roots. And the Spirit of Yahweh shall rest on him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, a spirit of knowledge and the fear of Yahweh. His delight shall be in the fear of Yahweh. He shall not judge by what he sees or what he hears with the ear, but with righteousness he shall judge the poor, and decide with equity for the meek of the earth. He shall strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he shall kill the wicked. Righteousness shall be a belt around his waist, and faithfulness the belt around his loins. I'm going to get to the second half in a minute. There's a couple of different ideas of what this prophetic text might be about, as far as chronologically or historically. And with many of the future-leaning prophetic words, it's difficult to tell, including this one. Some people think this is about an 8th century event. Some people think that this is addressing a context in the post-exilic period, so long after 8th century Isaiah. And I'm not assuming that we're all you all have 8th century historical events in mind, so let me run through a few of these. But this is a text that is picked up at the end of Isaiah, in Isaiah 65, verse 25, especially actually the part that I didn't read, that none would do harm on the mountain of the Lord. It's also picked up in Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 14. And Isaiah 65, I think, is from a much later period of time that the wolf and the lamb would lay down together. So some see this vision as one where the people have come back from exile and they're in Jerusalem or they're in Judah, and the fact is life is not nearly as good as Isaiah 40 through 55 told them it would be. Life is hard and people are fighting and there's not peace and there's struggle. And so here's the word of the Lord to give some hope. And I think hope is a really important component of what this passage is about. But people need hope at all periods of time, in the exilic period of time. Those who had put it in the 8th century, during the time of Isaiah, might put this in the during the Hezekiah's reign. So in 701, Sennacherib, the Assyrian king, laid siege to, he says, 46 cities in Judah, just annihilated the people of Judah. The only thing left standing then is Jerusalem, the holy city, which of course then kind of supports this God protects his city theology. But in light of that, and in light of later events that follow this, perhaps there's despair. And so we have this prophetic word about peace, about a kingdom to come, about a future hope, when wolf and lamb would lay down together. The chapter prior to this is all about warfare. It's all about Assyria, as the Assyrian king using the rod that God has given him to punish the enemies, that God holding out his hand toward his enemies, and the people not repenting, the people not returning back to the Lord. And so maybe there's a connection here. In fact, the very end of 10 is the majestic trees falling. In the beginning of 11 is that a shoot will come out of a stump, a tree that's been felled, and yet a shoot still comes out of this stump. And the stump is the line of Jesse, the Davidic line. So there's going to be a new king. Chapter 9 of Isaiah was, I think, about the time, kind of an overly hopeful vision of what Hezekiah would do as a king. That he would be a prince who would rule in place of the Lord. He would bring justice, that he would bring peace. They just have this continual resistance and enduring hope for something that seems so unbelievable. And I want us to think about that dynamic today, because I think about it a lot. So I hang on to that as we read through this. Like, do these people really believe that this would come to be? Do they really believe this kind of peace? The vision for the king would be that this branch, this new king would be anointed with the Spirit of the Lord. And by Yahweh's Spirit, he would execute wisdom and understanding. He would have these spiritual gifts. There's so much Paul in this before Paul ever was. Spiritual gifts and the spiritual armor. It's all here. The Spirit would help him make good decisions. Would have knowledge that would execute and bring about peace. A kind of unreal peace in some ways. God had this hope for humanity at one point, in the very beginning. And in some ways, the vision in Isaiah 11 is a return to Eden, when wolf and lamb laid down together and the lions ate straw. They didn't eat meat at the very beginning. They didn't eat each other. And so this seems to be what life is like where God reigns, what life is like where God is king. But because of several years of disappointment and conflict and turmoil and trouble, now the hope is not that all of humanity would rule like God rules, but that this one would rise up and would rule as God's king, that execute God's kingship. I don't want to go too far into the nuts and bolts. I kind of do, but I'm not going to go into the nuts and bolts of exegesis. There are some really interesting things here. I think it's important that he's instituting peace with the rod of his mouth, whereas Assyria has the rod. He's wielding his rod of the sword. That he is doing away with the wicked, killing the wicked with the breath of his mouth. That he speaks the word. And this is very divine-like. This is the way God works. The righteousness and faithfulness, the terms here are more like his undergarments. They're like part of him. There's kind of intimate clothing. His righteousness to the core. He is faithful. And then this vision, the wolf and the lamb lie down together. The leopard lies down with the kid, and the calf and the lion fattening together. A little child shall lead them. The cow and the bear shall graze. Their young shall lie down together, and the lion shall eat straw like an ox. The nursing child shall play over the hole of the asp. Incidentally, maybe not incidentally, in the garden, Adam and Eve are essentially like little kids. And they have this kind of intimacy with the wild things, and then that's lost. But the vision is that someday this would be the state of things again. The weaned child shall put its hand over the adder's den. They will not hurt, they will not destroy on my holy mountain, so where God rules. And not only where God rules, but the whole earth will be full of the knowledge of the Lord, as expansive as the waters cover the sea. But this has been brought up before. The point here is that knowing the Lord knowing the Lord, knowing Yahweh is the first step and the essential step to this peace coming about. The one who rules, which show us how to know the Lord. And certainly we read this rightly in light of Christ, because we live in a world, we live in light of resurrection. We live in light of the one who has come full of the knowledge and come full of the Spirit of the Lord, who has executed wisdom, showed us how to live justly. And yet, right, there's this and yet. Think about our prayer requests. There's just turmoil and disasters and broken systems all over the place. I wrote some of these broken systems down as part of my preparation here. Social Security, I heard that one on the internet this week. I thought, oh, that's probably broken. Trade, global disparities, modern practices of slavery. Political, it doesn't take much to look at our political world and see the brokenness. Our legal system has flaws and errors, it's broken. And that there's ours in the world. Our prison system is broken. Mass incarceration, lack of efficacy. Heard a podcast on debating the death penalty, not to get into that debate right now, just to know that there's debate and there's brokenness and there's problems. The educational systems, achievement gap, and so on. There are stark and real problems, and it doesn't take much to observe these, to know these. One of my, the one I want to talk about tomorrow, I get tomorrow in chapel as well, is agriculture and the ecology. I want to get practical tomorrow, but I want to think about the big picture today, because the problems seem overwhelming, and no doubt the problems seemed overwhelming in the 8th century. The problems seemed overwhelming in the 7th and the 6th and down through the centuries. The problems seem overwhelming in the 2nd century AD, after Christ. The problems didn't go away. And so what do we do with this vision, this kind of overwhelming vision of hope? And I don't know that they necessarily thought of it as eschatological back in the 8th century. It may have just been kind of a hyperbolic notion of peace. How can we possibly imagine peace? But certainly it comes to kind of be a vision for what's to come. And there are signs of hope. On the one hand, I'm pretty overwhelmed, just personally. When I in fact, I stopped paying attention to politics and I'm less overwhelmed. And yet that doesn't solve any problems, and many of our problems are political. So part of me doesn't want to politicize anything, right? I imagine you're here with me. I don't want to be overly political, and yet we need big solutions to big problems, and then what can I do? And this is where I think Isaiah 11 really helps us. It calls us to a kind of future, a vision that is so impossible that this has got to be God's work alone. And yet it doesn't leave us there. It's not escapism, because the book of Isaiah continually calls people to act faithfully and with justice, to live out the ideals of our future. I was talking in our family we have devotionals sometimes, and what we're doing right now is we have a suggestion box. I have 3 teenagers, so they're old enough for a suggestion box, I think. They're senior and junior and a freshman. And one of the suggestions, we just pick one out and we have a family conversation. It's been fun so far, but one of them, and this was my wife's suggestion that got pulled out, is let's give Sage, my oldest, who's going to college next year, let's give her advice for her first year of college. And Sage does not like talking about the future. But she took it like the wise person she was intended to be. She took our advice. But she also quoted some C.S. Lewis. This is awesome for me as a dad. So she's been assigned to read the Screw Tape Letters in her class down the hill here for English class. And she pulled this out when we were all trying to give her advice about the future. And she paraphrased that essentially C.S. Lewis would have us believe and think about not the future and not the past, but the present and the eternal. And so I'm like, I gotta read this. So let me read you a bit of a letter from Wormwood to Screwtape. And if you know this book, you know this is sort of satanic advice to getting at sort of how to stump a Christian, how to lead them into sin. He said, the human lives in time, but our enemy, capital E, God, destines them to eternity. He therefore, I believe, wants them to attend chiefly to two things, to eternity itself and to the point of time which they call the present. For the present is the point at which time touches eternity. Of the present moment, and of it only, humans have an experience analogous to the experience that which our enemy has of the reality as a whole. Let me pause here. The enemy, God, has this kind of eternal perspective. Not so much like he's just waiting for the good by and by, but an eternal perspective on the present. And when we experience the present, we kind of step into God's eternity. He would therefore have them continually concerned with their eternity, which means being concerned with him or with the present, either meditating on their eternal union with or separation from himself, or else obeying the present voice of conscience, bearing present cross, receiving the present grace, giving thanks for the present pleasure. Our business is to get them away from the eternal and from the present. With this in view, we sometimes tempt a human, say a widow or a scholar, to live in the past. But this is of limited value, for they have some real knowledge of the past, and it has a determinate nature. And to that extent resembles eternity. It is far better to make them live in the future. Biological necessity makes all their passions point in that direction already, so that thought about the future inflames hope and fear. And in her column, she has this underlined, she has college next to that. She had that written before our conversation. But what I think is important here and how it relates to Isaiah is, this is future. Isaiah 11 is about the future, a future peace, and the ideal kingdom. And yet, and in light of Christ, I think it's the eternal peace. It's this what's to come. What is God's ideal? And that is the eternal. And rather than dwelling or worrying anyway about the future, this is what overwhelms me. Perhaps I need to think about today. Not to escape what's to come, but to sort of live God's ideal now. And isn't that all that we can do? Like workers in the vineyard working our corner of the vineyard. What can we do? That doesn't mean that we're not concerned about the big problems. That doesn't mean that we don't get involved with awesome works like Agape or Hope Works or the church. God calls us to live out this together. But I find hope in this. I think this is what calls us to worship. And I'm still in despair, like Ecclesiastes in some sense. I don't think we can ignore this, but we can't escape it. I was thinking the only way to escape this maybe is to live off the grid. But I don't think that really solves any of the problems, as much as it might appeal to some of us. So today I just wanted to lay out this text again. And I know that we've heard it. And Isaiah 11 is not the only one. You can look at Ezekiel. You see the same kinds of visions for peace, for lion and to eat the straw, the wolf and lamb laying down together, a new heaven and new earth. Someday God's going to do something amazing. And it's often in those moments of despair and strife that many of our songs about heaven, about the future, come out of depression and slavery. And they need to have their voice. And now when things are fairly good, we can stop kind of singing about those things. Isaiah 11 is a song about an ideal future coming out of despair, to take up praise, and also to call God to make his kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. And this is who we are. Thank God for the grace and that the future is in his hands. Let's pray. God, thank you for the story that we have, for the story of your people struggling like we struggle, in maybe even more extreme ways. Thank you for hearing our concerns, and I trust that you hear us now in the name of Jesus, and we call for your kingdom to come on earth like it is in heaven, where you rule, where there's justice and equity and peace, and all things are made right. And yes, God, we long for that day. But God, give us wisdom by your Spirit. Give us understanding and boldness and courage to take up the case of the poor, to take up the case of the outcast, to step in without concern for our future, but concern for your kingdom, where you call us to be. And by your grace, God, I thank you for using us for your kingdom purposes. Give us vision, give us hope, and continue to inspire us to live today more for you. In Jesus' name.